My wife kissed another man during our romantic dinner date, so I paid the bill and vanished from her life forever. Hey Reddit, my name is Tyler, and this is the story of how my world collapsed on what should have been just another ordinary Tuesday morning. I was on kitchen duty that day, standing at the granite countertop peeling an orange like it was any other mundane task. The morning light was streaming through the blinds, hitting the counter in hard, angular slants that made everything look sharp and defined. Our house smelled like citrus and fresh linen. Everything felt clean and sterile in that perfect way that usually made me feel content. I hadn't even had my coffee yet, just moving through my morning routine on autopilot. That's when truth sliced into my life like a scalpel sliding under the ribs, quiet, precise, and absolutely irreversible. Her phone lit up on the table beside the sink, lying face down and buzzing like a trapped heart under glass. One buzz, then two, then three in rapid succession. The pattern was too fast for spam, too casual for work, and definitely too insistent to ignore. I glanced over not because I was suspicious. I had trained myself not to be that kind of husband, but because the damn thing just wouldn't stop buzzing. That's when I saw it. Miss you already. The preview flashed for maybe half a second before the screen dimmed, but it was long enough. I didn't need to touch the phone or unlock it to understand exactly what I was looking at. I knew that tone immediately. That smug, lazy kind of texting confidence that drips with intimacy. You don't send messages like that to a stranger, and you certainly don't send them to just a friend. This was something else entirely. Something that made my stomach drop even as my brain tried to rationalize it away. Lisa was still upstairs, the blow dryer humming like background static, while my world collapsed in absolute silence below. What surprised most people later, when I told this story, was that I didn't confront her right then and there. Instead, I finished peeling that orange methodically, eating it slowly slice by slice, the bitterness sharp on my tongue as I stared at her glowing phone like it was a bomb about to detonate. I kept thinking that if I stared long enough, maybe the screen would crack open and reveal everything I needed to know. But of course, it didn't work that way. When she finally came downstairs, she was barefoot and wearing one of my old shirts, humming something cheerful under her breath like it was just another perfectly normal Tuesday. She kissed the top of my head with the same casual affection she'd shown me 1,000 times before, then asked if I could drop her at that little cafe on Maple Street. She said she was meeting Beth from work for coffee. I didn't ask which Beth. I didn't mention the message I'd seen. I just nodded and said, "Sure, let's go," even though every instinct in my body was screaming that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. The cafe was packed when we arrived, forcing me to double park outside while Lisa gathered her things. She leaned over and kissed me again, her lips soft and familiar against mine. "Be good," she said, with that almost teasing tone she used when she was in a particularly good mood. Then she opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. I noticed she was wearing those black heels, the ones she never wore for me anymore. They clicked against the concrete like punctuation marks, like exclamation points at the end of a lie I was only beginning to understand. I watched her walk toward the cafe entrance, expecting to see her scan the room for Beth, maybe wave at a coworker sitting alone with a laptop and a latte. But that's not what happened. Instead, I watched her walk directly to him. He was already waiting at a corner table, arms spread wide like he owned not just the seat, but the entire room and everything in it. When she reached him, she didn't give him the polite hug you'd give a colleague or the quick embrace you'd share with a casual friend. She leaned down and hugged him like it was the first breath she'd taken all week, like she'd been holding it in until this exact moment. I sat there in my illegally parked car, engine still running, watching my wife's hand slide up the back of this man's neck. I watched her whisper something in his ear that made him grin with the kind of satisfaction that comes from shared secrets. She didn't look back at me once, not once, as she settled into the chair across from him and leaned forward with the body language of someone who was exactly where she wanted to be. The drive home was a blur of gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers went completely numb. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even turn on the radio. I just drove in complete silence, trying to process what I just witnessed while my brain kept offering up increasingly desperate explanations. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe I was misreading the situation. Maybe there was some perfectly reasonable explanation for why my wife had just embraced another man like a lover returning from war. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I'd known it the moment I saw that text message, and I'd known it even more certainly when I watched her walk into that cafe like she was walking into her real life, the one that didn't include me. That night, she came home smelling like someone else's cologne. The scent was subtle but unmistakable. Something expensive and woody, That definitely wasn't mine. She curled into bed beside me and sighed deeply, saying she was exhausted from catching up with Beth about all the workplace drama. "I'm so tired," she murmured against my shoulder. "Me too," I replied, and I meant it in ways she couldn't possibly understand. I couldn't sleep that night. Not from anger, not even from heartbreak exactly, but from a strange electric stillness that had settled into my bones. It felt like I'd swallowed a storm and it was refusing to pass through me. She lay beside me, breathing slow and steady, her face turned toward the window. One leg curled over mine, like we were still the same couple we'd been that morning. But her body felt miles away, like she was already somewhere else entirely. I stared at the ceiling and listened. To her breathing, to the distant hum of traffic outside, to the sound of something precious dying between us that neither of us had the courage to name out loud yet. At 2:47 a.m., I finally gave up on sleep entirely. I got up from bed and walked barefoot to the living room, where her laptop sat on the coffee table like it was waiting for me. It was unlocked. Either through dumb luck or maybe arrogance, or maybe she just didn't think I would ever look. That last possibility broke something in me before I even clicked on anything. The idea that she either didn't care enough to hide it or didn't respect me enough to think I'd ever find out. Her inbox had a folder marked work stuff in that casual, innocuous way that immediately made my stomach clench. Inside were emails. Not many, just enough to paint a picture I really didn't want to see. "Still thinking about your lips during that meeting today," read one. Another said, "He's so clueless, babe, it's almost cute." But the one that made my hands shake was simple and direct. "I'll book the room again next week." The timestamps were like sharp knives cutting through my memory. Every date lined up perfectly with her fake brunches, her made-up work retreats, her sudden need to help friends through various crises. One email thread even had photos attached. Not naked pictures or anything explicitly sexual, but something that hurt so much worse. They were just smiling. Normal, happy, couple-like photos of them together. There was one of her in that blue dress I'd bought for our anniversary, standing way too close to him in some wine bar I'd never seen before. In the photo, he was holding her hand under the table, and she was looking at him with an expression I recognized, but hadn't seen directed at me in months. The file names were mundane and perfectly innocent. Q2 planning notes, HR slide deck, hidden in plain sight like a crime scene that had been scrubbed clean with bleach and charm. I didn't touch anything. I didn't forward the emails to myself, or take screenshots or gather evidence for some future confrontation. I just sat there and stared, letting every word soak into me like acid, memorizing the details because part of me needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went. The casual tone of their messages, the inside jokes, the way they talked about me like I was an obstacle to navigate around rather than a person whose life they were systematically destroying. Around 5:23 a.m., I finally went back to bed. She shifted in her sleep when I slipped under the covers, muttering something that might have been my name or might have been his. I didn't ask, didn't try to make out the words clearly. I just lay there beside her, staring at the ceiling until dawn started creeping through the blinds. The next morning, she was surprisingly chipper. She made scrambled eggs and played a podcast too loud, dancing around the kitchen in her socks like she was auditioning for a commercial about domestic bliss. She asked if I wanted to go to the farmer's market like we used to do on weekends when we were still trying to be the kind of couple who bought organic vegetables and artisanal bread. I told her no, said I had errands to run. She kissed my cheek and left, sunlight catching in her hair as she jingled her keys with the same careless happiness she'd always had. Like absolutely nothing was wrong. Like she hadn't spent the night before texting another man about missing the way he grabbed her hips while I was sleeping 3 feet away from her. After she left, I stood by the window and watched her car disappear down the street. The house went quiet again, and I found myself laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because it was all so horrifically, perfectly real. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd trusted with everything, had built an entire secret life right under my nose and made it look effortless. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I found myself driving nowhere in particular, just following long, endless roads that threaded through neighborhoods we used to walk through hand in hand. Every turn brought back echoes of our laughter, bouncing off brick walls and old trees, memories of when we were still discovering each other instead of hiding from each other. But every familiar street corner and every shared memory kept leading me back to the same devastating realization. There was a version of her I never knew existed. This was the woman who could kiss me goodnight with genuine tenderness, and then, in the same hour, text him about missing the way he grabbed her hips. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How could someone compartmentalize their life so completely? How could the same hands that held mine during movies also type messages that would destroy me if I ever found them? I eventually ended up at the lake where we used to go before we were married, back when love felt simple and straightforward. Before we had to worry about joint bank accounts and house keys, and syncing our calendars around each other's lives. I sat on the hood of my car and watched the water move slow and heavy, like it understood something about loss that I was still trying to grasp. The water seemed to promise that if I just stared at it long enough, it might pull this terrible ache out of me and carry it somewhere far away. But of course, that's not how healing works. The pain was mine to carry, and no amount of wishful thinking was going to change that. My phone buzzed, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was her. "Tyler, you okay? You left early this morning. Everything good?" I stared at the message until the screen dimmed, not because of the content, but because of the tone. It was so perfectly crafted to sound caring and concerned, like she was genuinely worried about my well-being. Like she hadn't just spent the previous evening feeding another man the same loving attention she used to give me. I could still hear her laugh from the cafe 2 days ago, replaying in my head like a broken record. That wasn't the laugh of someone making a mistake or having a moment of weakness. That was the laugh of someone who had found something she'd been missing. Someone who was exactly where she wanted to be. I didn't respond to her text. Instead, I drove home and started looking, not for more emails or more evidence of the affair itself, but for the patterns underneath it all. I wanted to understand the architecture of her deception, to map out exactly how she'd managed to construct this elaborate double life while I was sleeping beside her every night. The lies behind the lies became increasingly clear as I dug deeper. The days she claimed she was grading papers late at the school, the nights she said she had back-to-back parent conferences that ran until almost midnight. The more I mapped it all out, the more grotesquely perfect it became. She had created a whole rhythm of deception, carefully balancing just enough truth to keep me from getting suspicious with just enough space to keep herself warm in someone else's arms. Every alibi had been crafted with surgical precision. Every excuse had been delivered with just the right amount of exhaustion or frustration to make it believable. She hadn't just been cheating on me. She'd been studying me, learning exactly how much I would accept before I started asking questions. Then came the part I wasn't ready for, the piece of evidence that would shatter whatever small hope I might have been clinging to. I was vacuuming the hallway when a folded receipt slipped out of her coat pocket and fluttered to the floor. My first instinct was to throw it away without looking, just another piece of daily clutter that accumulates in pockets and purses. But something made me pause and actually read it. Hotel Riverside, room 318. 1 king deluxe suite, 3 guests maximum, no checkout time listed. The date stamped at the bottom was last Friday. The same Friday when she'd told me her friend Sophie was having a complete mental breakdown and desperately needed her to stay over for emotional support. She'd even shown me a text from Sophie that said, "Can't do this alone tonight," complete with crying emojis and desperate punctuation. I stood there in my hallway, vacuum cleaner humming beside me, staring at this small piece of paper that contained enough information to destroy what was left of my faith in her. What hurt, almost as much as the betrayal itself, was the sheer effort she'd put into dressing up the lie. She hadn't just made up an excuse. She'd created an entire supporting narrative, complete with fake text messages from a friend who was probably completely unaware that her name was being used as cover for an affair. I set the receipt on the coffee table in the living room. I didn't hide it or put it somewhere safe for later confrontation. I just left it there, right in the open like a landmine waiting to be discovered. Maybe I wanted her to find it. Maybe I wanted her to know that I knew. Maybe I was just curious to see how deep this hole of deception really went, how many layers of lies she was prepared to stack on top of each other. She came home at 7:15 p.m., hair pulled up in a messy bun, smiling that same contented smile she'd been wearing for weeks now. She saw the receipt immediately. It was impossible to miss. And she paused for just a moment, her eyes focusing on it like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then she picked it up slowly, examined it with the kind of careful attention you'd give to a document written in a foreign language, and said something that made my blood run cold. "This isn't mine." Just like that. No hesitation, no nervous laughter, no attempt to explain or contextualize. She looked me straight in the eye and delivered the lie with calm confidence and a soft, almost concerned voice, as if she was worried about my mental state for even suggesting such a thing. I looked at her for a long time, studying her face for any crack in the facade, any sign that she understood how insulting this was. Finally, I said, "You're really going to lie to me with your car still warm in the driveway from wherever you just came from?" She stared back at me, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. There was something twitching behind her left cheek, like a mask that was starting to slip just slightly. Then she said the words that would echo in my head for months afterward. "You're being paranoid again, Tyler. Maybe you should get some sleep." Paranoid? Again. Like this was a pattern of behavior on my part, like I was the one with the problem. Like finding a hotel receipt with her name on it was some kind of delusion I'd invented to make both our lives more difficult. The next morning, she acted like absolutely nothing had happened. She hummed while making coffee, actually hummed like she was auditioning for a commercial about domestic happiness. The sound was almost surreal, given what had transpired the night before. This woman who had looked me in the eye and denied a hotel receipt with her name on it was now moving around our kitchen like she didn't have a care in the world. I sat across from her at the breakfast table, watching in stunned silence as she sliced an apple with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else in her carefully constructed life. She was preparing it like she was getting ready for a picnic, completely at ease, completely in control. This was the same woman who, less than 12 hours ago, had called me paranoid for confronting her with physical evidence of her betrayal. She handed me a slice of apple across the table, her voice light and innocent, and somehow weaponized in its normalcy. "You want some cinnamon with it?" she asked, as if we were just a regular couple sharing a regular breakfast on a regular morning. I couldn't answer. I couldn't even look at her anymore. I stood up and walked to the living room, desperate for space, desperate for silence, desperate for anything that might help me make sense of what was happening to my life. But what I got instead was her following me, apple slice still in hand, like we were in some twisted domestic commercial. "You've been in a really strange mood lately," she said, settling onto the couch like she was preparing for a reasonable conversation between adults. "You need to start trusting me more." That did it. That snapped something fundamental inside me that I hadn't even realized was still holding together. The sheer audacity of it. Telling me I needed to trust her more after everything I'd discovered was so breathtaking that for a moment I couldn't even speak. "Trust you?" I turned to face her fully, and I could hear my voice rising despite my attempts to stay calm. "Trust you after you spent the night in room 318 at Hotel Riverside? Trust you after he sent you a message saying he misses your lips? Trust you after you told me Sophie was falling apart and needed you when Sophie was actually just the alibi of the week?" I watched her face change as I laid out everything I knew. Her smile didn't disappear all at once. It wasn't fear or panic that replaced it. Instead, there was just this subtle shift. The kind of expression you see when a magician realizes their trick has been exposed, and they're trying to decide whether to keep up the illusion or abandon it entirely. "That's not what you think it is," she said quickly, her voice taking on a slightly higher pitch. "It's really not, Tyler." "Don't insult me, Lisa," I replied, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Don't you dare try to play this like I'm the one who's confused about what I saw." She put the apple slice down on the coffee table, and her whole demeanor shifted. The mask of domestic contentment fell away completely, and what replaced it wasn't sadness or remorse. It was contempt. Pure, undiluted contempt. "So what? You're checking my emails now?" she snapped, her voice sharp with accusation. "You're going through my stuff while I'm asleep? Jesus Christ, Tyler, you sound like a complete control freak." And there it was. The deflection, the blame, the complete inversion of reality that I should have seen coming. She was taking the wreckage of our marriage, the destruction she had created through months of systematic deception, and handing it to me like it was my fault. Like I was the villain in this story for having the audacity to discover what she'd been doing behind my back. "You've been gone from this marriage for years," she continued, her voice getting louder and more bitter with each word. "You think I wanted this? You think I planned to need someone else? Maybe if you'd looked at me the way he does, I wouldn't have needed to feel that connection with someone else." That last line hit me like a physical blow. Maybe if you'd looked at me like he does, I wouldn't have needed to feel that with someone else. She was rewriting our entire history in real time, turning her deliberate betrayal into my failure as a husband. That final accusation, that somehow this was all my fault for not looking at her the right way, broke something in me that I didn't even know was still intact. I didn't yell back at her, didn't throw anything, didn't engage with her attempt to rewrite our history. Instead, I walked upstairs and started packing a bag. Not everything, just the essentials. A jacket, 2 shirts, my toothbrush, and a photo of my dad and me fishing when I was 11 years old. It was the only thing left in that house that didn't lie to me, the only object that hadn't been tainted by her web of deception. Everything else, our furniture, our shared belongings, even the walls themselves, felt contaminated by the knowledge of what she'd been doing while I slept beside her. She didn't follow me upstairs. She didn't try to stop me or apologize or make one last desperate attempt to explain herself. The silence from downstairs was telling. It was like she'd expected this moment, like she'd been waiting for me to finally reach my breaking point and remove myself from the equation. Maybe it would even make things easier for her, not having to sneak around anymore. I walked out the front door with my bag slung over my shoulder, and she didn't even come to the window to watch me leave. The finality of it was almost surreal. After everything we'd built together, after all the years of shared dreams and plans, it ended with me walking out of our house while she sat in our living room, probably already planning how to spin this story to her friends. I checked into a quiet motel off Route 12, the kind of place where the desk clerk doesn't ask your name twice, and the ice machine hums louder than your thoughts. The room smelled like industrial bleach and old cardboard, and it had one bed, one lamp, and a chair with a missing leg. But it was mine. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I could breathe without second-guessing the air around me. I sat on the edge of that sagging mattress, staring at my phone as it lit up with her attempts to contact me. 4 missed calls in the span of an hour, all from her. No voicemails, though, just that red notification badge pulsing on my screen like an open wound. Finally, a text came through, and it was exactly what I'd expected. Tyler, we should talk. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what she'd done. Just the diplomatic version of, I know that you know, but I'm not ready to confess unless you back me into a corner. It was the same careful, calculated approach she'd been using for months, giving away just enough to maintain plausible deniability while keeping her options open. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned the phone off completely and lay back on the bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles. I thought about everything. About how love can rot quietly without making a sound. About how someone can smile at you over breakfast while planning to betray you before dinner. I thought about our wedding day, about the vows she'd made, about the tears in her eyes when she promised she'd never lie to me. And now here I was, alone in a motel room where even the bedside clock didn't tick properly, trying to remember what that version of her had even sounded like, trying to figure out when exactly she'd died and been replaced by this stranger who could look me in the eye and deny her own hotel receipts. The next day, I made the decision to go back to the house. Not to talk to her, not to attempt some kind of reconciliation, but simply to get the rest of my belongings. I needed my clothes, my laptop, my grandfather's watch, the practical remnants of a life I was apparently no longer living. I walked through the front door without knocking, using my key because legally it was still my home too, but I didn't feel like a resident anymore. I felt like a visitor in the museum of someone else's life. She was there on the couch, wearing my old hoodie like it was some kind of statement piece, like wearing my clothes could somehow communicate something meaningful about her emotional state. Her face looked like she hadn't slept much. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her eyes were swollen in that particular way that comes from either crying or staying up too late staring at screens. "Hey," she said softly, like she was trying to gauge my mood before deciding how to play this scene. "You're just going to pack up your stuff without talking to me?" "Yes," I replied, not even slowing down as I headed toward the stairs. She stood up and took a step toward me, like maybe the physical distance between us was something that could still be bridged with the right words or gestures. "You're seriously doing this? You're just walking away from everything we built together?" I dropped the pair of jeans I'd been folding into my duffel bag and turned to look at her. There was something in her eyes that I hadn't expected to see. Not guilt, not sadness, but frustration. As if I was the one being unreasonable. As if my decision to leave was somehow the real problem in this situation. She let out a long, performative sigh, the kind designed to communicate how exhausted she was by my inability to be rational about this. Then she said something that made my blood freeze. It was only one time. My hand stopped moving entirely. She saw that reaction and seemed to take it as permission to continue. "It was only one time," she repeated, her voice quieter now, more careful. "I swear to you, Tyler, it didn't mean anything." I stared at her for what felt like an eternity. And then I started laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because the audacity of it was so breathtaking that laughter was the only response my brain could produce. She was still lying, even now. even after everything I'd discovered. Even with the hotel receipts and the emails and the messages about missing his lips, she was going to try to minimize it into a single moment of weakness. Really? I said, still laughing that hollow, joyless laugh. Because it looks like you fucked him in multiple hotels, sent him hundreds of messages, and built an entire secret relationship while I was sleeping 3 feet away from you. But sure, let's call it one time, if that makes you feel better about yourself. Her face hardened, and I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not remorse, but annoyance at being caught in yet another lie. I didn't think you'd come back here, she said, and her voice had turned almost bitter. You left. You made your choice very clear. I made my choice clear? I stepped closer to her, and she actually flinched. You made your choice clear when you decided to start fucking your coworker. You made it clear when you invited him into our bed. You made it clear every single time you lied to my face about where you were and who you were with. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had opened up in our living room floor. Then she said the words that would haunt me for months. Maybe if you had been around more, if you had paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere for what I wasn't getting at home. And there it was again. The victim card. The complete inversion of responsibility. According to her twisted logic, her systematic betrayal was actually my fault for not being attentive enough, for not somehow intuiting that she was unhappy and addressing it before she decided to address it herself in the most destructive way possible. I looked at her standing there in my hoodie, trying to rewrite history in real time, and I felt something inside me settle into a cold, hard certainty. You weren't alone, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. You were never alone. You were just bored. And now you're not sorry. You're just ashamed that I figured it out. She stepped back as if the physical distance could somehow soften the impact of what I was saying. So what now? She asked, her voice taking on a defensive edge. You want me to get on my knees and beg for forgiveness? You want me to say I'm some kind of monster? I picked up my grandfather's watch from the dresser and dropped it into my bag, not even looking at her as I spoke. I don't want anything from you anymore, Lisa. That's the point. Her lips started to tremble, and I couldn't tell if it was from guilt, regret, or just pure rage at being called out so directly. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to fall for him, you know. And that was the final nail in the coffin of whatever we'd had together. Because she wasn't denying it anymore. She wasn't claiming it was just physical or just a mistake or just a moment of weakness. She had fallen for him. She hadn't tripped over her own emotions or gotten caught up in something beyond her control. She had jumped, willingly and repeatedly, into something that she knew would destroy us. I walked past her without another word, down the stairs, through the living room where we'd had our first fight about whose turn it was to do the dishes, past the kitchen where she'd made me breakfast on our first morning as homeowners. She didn't follow me this time, and I didn't look back. The world outside felt foreign and strange, like I was stepping into a different country where the air was thinner and the gravity worked differently. My car was still parked where I'd left it, but even that felt surreal. Like I was borrowing someone else's life, someone else's problems, someone else's heartbreak. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, not to drive anywhere in particular, just to feel something solid beneath my hands. The steering wheel was real, the engine was real, the road ahead of me was real. Everything else felt like it was dissolving around the edges. When I finally started the engine, I didn't drive back to the motel immediately. Instead, I drove out of town, away from everything familiar, onto highways that sliced through trees and fields that didn't care about human drama. I drove until I found myself in the parking lot of her school at 4 a.m., though I couldn't have told you exactly why I'd ended up there. The parking lot was empty except for one car, a smug little hatchback with tinted windows and vanity plates that read MRDMBA. Mr. David, apparently. Middle school biology teacher and part-time home wrecker. I knew it was his car because it was the same one I'd seen parked at that cafe, the same one that had been occupying the space in my wife's life that used to belong to me. I parked across the street and waited, though I'm not sure what I was waiting for. At 4:17 a.m., the side door of the school opened, and he stepped out with a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked around casually, lit a cigarette, and took his time like he owned the place. Then a second figure appeared in the doorway. Her, Lisa. Her hair was down, and she was wearing his jacket. Not her own, but his. She walked over to him like this was the most natural thing in the world. Like they met in empty school parking lots at 4 a.m. every day of the week. And then she kissed him. Not a quick, guilty goodbye kiss, but a real one. The kind of kiss that spoke of intimacy and comfort, and a relationship that had moved far beyond stolen moments and secret hotel rooms. They laughed about something, shared some private joke that I would never be part of, and then they separated to their respective cars. I sat there watching this scene unfold, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and I realized that this wasn't desperation or lust or even rebellion. This was love, or at least, it was what she thought love looked like. She had built something real with him while I was at home trying to patch up what I thought we still had together. I realized in that moment, sitting in my car watching them part ways like lovers who had all the time in the world, that she hadn't made a mistake. She had made a choice. Not once, not twice, but every single day since she'd let him into her life. She had chosen this. Chosen him. Chosen to build something new and real while I was still at home trying to patch up what I thought we still had together. They laughed together one more time before getting into their separate cars, and I watched them drive away in different directions like they were heading home from the most natural thing in the world. She got into her car, he got into his, and I sat there with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Then I started the engine and drove back to the motel, not to talk to anyone or call anyone or figure out what came next. I just needed to be somewhere that was mine. Somewhere that didn't echo with the sound of her laughter or smell like her perfume, or remind me of all the ways I'd been living in a carefully constructed lie. Back in that cramped motel room, I sat on the edge of the bed with my coat still on and the blinds drawn tight. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from rage exactly, but from the pure gravitational pull of what I'd discovered. She wasn't just having an affair, she was in love with him. I'd seen it in her body language, in the way she'd reached for his hand without hesitation, in the way she'd leaned into him like he was her home now. It wasn't a fling or a moment of weakness or even just physical attraction. It was a complete emotional investment in someone who wasn't me. She had quietly, systematically transferred all the affection and intimacy that used to belong to our marriage and given it to someone else. And from what I could tell, that transition was now complete. I kept thinking about what I'd missed, what signs I should have seen, what I could have done differently. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I hadn't missed anything at all. I hadn't failed to notice the warning signs. She had buried them carefully and strategically, curating her betrayal like a performance where every scene was designed to look just believable enough to keep me from asking the right questions. And I had loved her too much to see what was rotting underneath all that careful presentation. I had trusted her enough to take her explanations at face value, to believe her when she said she was helping friends or staying late at work or dealing with family drama. I had been a good husband, and she had used that goodness against me. That morning, I finally replied to one of her messages. After days of silence, after watching her kiss another man in a school parking lot, after sitting in a motel room trying to figure out how my life had become unrecognizable, I sent her 3 words. I saw everything. No follow-up, no explanation, no room for her to twist my words or ask for clarification. Just a simple statement of fact that would let her know exactly where we stood. She called instantly. The phone rang and I let it go to voicemail. Then she tried again and again and again. Finally, a text came through. Tyler, I don't know what you think you saw, but it's not what you... That was her favorite line, wasn't it? Not what you think. Except it always was exactly what I thought. Every single time. I blocked her number before she could finish the sentence. Then I did something that surprised even me. I called a lawyer. Not out of spite or revenge, but because clarity had become its own form of mercy, both for her and for me. The decision itself took only seconds, like a switch being flipped that couldn't be turned back. I had spent weeks drowning in uncertainty and lies, and suddenly I knew exactly what needed to happen next. The paperwork would take a few weeks to process, I understood that much. But the actual decision, the choice to end this marriage and walk away from everything we'd built together, happened in an instant. There was no going back from what I'd seen, no amount of counseling or conversation that could rebuild trust from the ashes of such systematic deception. I packed up the motel room that afternoon and checked out without saying a word to the desk clerk. I didn't go back to the house. I didn't want to see her, didn't want to deal with more lies or explanations or desperate attempts to salvage something that was already dead. For all I cared, she could burn the place down. Every corner of it was soaked in falsehood anyway. Instead, I found a small rental place near the coast. Nothing fancy, just enough space to breathe and think without constantly bracing myself for the next lie. It was quiet and simple, and most importantly, it was mine. No shared history, no memories of better times, no lingering scent of her perfume on the pillows. I didn't tell anyone about the move at first, not even my brother. I needed silence more than sympathy, needed to remember what it felt like to exist without constantly questioning every interaction, every explanation, every smile. I needed to relearn how to trust my own perceptions instead of second-guessing them every time they conflicted with her version of reality. That first night in the new place, I lay on a mattress on the floor and watched shadows move across the ceiling. I thought about her hands, how they used to hold mine so tightly during movies that I thought they were afraid to let go. Now I understood that they were only afraid of being seen for what they really were. I thought about all the times she'd told me she loved me over the past few months, all the times she'd kissed me goodbye or curled up next to me in bed or asked about my day like she actually cared about the answer. Had any of it been real? Or had she just been going through the motions, playing the role of a devoted wife while her heart and mind were somewhere else entirely? The rain started around midnight, just a light drizzle that tapped against the windows like it was trying to get my attention. I didn't close the blinds or turn on music to drown it out. I just lay there and let it remind me that I was still here, still alive, still capable of existing independently, even after being completely hollowed out by someone I trusted with everything. On my way to get coffee the next morning, I stopped at a small cafe and sat by the window. There was a couple at the table next to me, probably in their mid-30s, laughing over something on a shared phone screen. His arm was draped casually over the back of her chair, and her hand rested on his knee with the kind of unconscious intimacy that comes from real trust. I watched them for a moment and thought, will I ever be able to trust someone like that again? I honestly didn't know. But I also realized that seeing their obvious affection didn't make me flinch or feel bitter. It just made me wonder if there was a version of love out there that didn't come with lies and secret phone calls and hotel receipts hidden in coat pockets. Maybe that was something. Maybe that was the beginning of whatever came next. It all ended not with a bang, but with a signature. 2 months later, I found myself sitting across from her in a lawyer's office that smelled like industrial air conditioning and printer toner. It was neutral territory. 2 chairs, 1 table, and notably, no wedding rings on either of our fingers. She wore a gray blazer and no makeup, her hair tied back in a style that seemed calculated to look professional and contrite at the same time. We didn't speak when she walked into the room, and neither did I. We both just nodded like strangers acknowledging each other on a long flight delay. Polite, distant, carefully avoiding eye contact. The attorney slid papers across the table with practiced efficiency, explaining terms and conditions that I had already read dozens of times in the weeks leading up to this moment. No kids to fight over, no major assets to divide, just the clinical dissolution of what had once been a life partnership. The whole process felt surreal in its lack of emotion. How something that had completely shattered my world could be reduced to manila folders and neutral legal phrases like dissolution of partnership. She signed first, her pen moving across the page without any hesitation whatsoever. Then she pushed the pen toward me, her eyes barely meeting mine for even a second. I held it for a moment, not because I didn't want to sign. I absolutely did. But because I found myself remembering fragments of our life together. The first time we'd held hands. The night we'd danced in our socks in that tiny kitchen in our first apartment. The honeymoon morning when she'd whispered against my shoulder, "I hope I never stop choosing you." I signed the papers, initialed every corner that needed initialing, and dated everything with the current date. Done. Finished. Legally dissolved. As we both stood to leave, she said something that I hadn't been prepared for. Her voice was soft, almost rehearsed, like she'd been practicing this line for weeks. "I never stopped loving you, you know." I looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time in months. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I didn't feel rage or hope or even disappointment. I felt empty. Not the broken, devastated kind of empty, but the finished kind. The kind that comes after everything that needed to be said has been said, and everything that needed to be done has been done. "No," I said simply. "You stopped. You just didn't notice when it happened." She blinked rapidly, maybe trying to keep tears from falling, maybe trying to force them out for effect. But I walked out of that office before I could care enough to figure out which one it was. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, and the sky was the color of old newspaper. But for the first time in nearly a year, I took a full, deep breath without feeling like I was suffocating. My lungs worked properly, my chest didn't feel compressed, and I didn't have to brace myself for the next lie or the next betrayal or the next casual rewriting of reality. That night, I went home to my small place near the coast and did something I hadn't done in months. I wrote something down. Not for her, not for closure, not even for catharsis. I wrote it for myself, as a reminder of what I'd learned and what I'd survived. It said, "You can survive the fire, but you don't walk back into the ashes looking for what you lost. You walk forward, even if your legs still shake, even if your heart still limps, because forward is the only honest direction left." If you're reading this story and you recognize yourself in where I was, broken, blind, stuck in a relationship that's grown fangs while you weren't looking, I need you to hear me when I say this. You are not the villain for walking away from someone who would rather lie to you than lose you. You are not crazy for wanting truth over comfort, for demanding honesty over convenience. You are not weak for grieving the loss of a person who, it turns out, never really existed in the first place. And you will heal. I know that probably sounds impossible right now, especially if you're sitting where I was sitting months ago, staring at evidence of betrayal and wondering how you missed all the signs. I know it feels like the pain is too big to ever shrink down to a manageable size, like the wound is too deep to ever properly close. But healing happens. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no magic moment when you wake up and suddenly feel whole again. Instead, it happens gradually, one honest step at a time. One morning when you realize you didn't think about them for the first hour after waking up. One conversation with a friend where you laugh genuinely for the first time in months. One moment when you see a couple holding hands and feel hopeful instead of bitter. The hardest part isn't even the betrayal itself. It's learning to trust your own perceptions again after someone has spent months or years convincing you that reality is different from what you can see with your own eyes. It's relearning how to believe your instincts instead of second-guessing them every time they conflict with someone else's version of events. But here's what I learned. Your instincts were right. That feeling in your stomach when something didn't add up, that was real. That sense that you were being lied to, even when you couldn't prove it, that was accurate. That growing suspicion that the person you loved was becoming someone you didn't recognize, that was your brain trying to protect you from a truth that your heart wasn't ready to accept. You don't have to forgive someone for destroying your trust just because they're sorry they got caught. You don't have to accept it was just one time when you know it was a systematic pattern of deception. You don't have to stay with someone who treats your love like it's disposable, who builds a secret life while you're trying to build a shared one. And most importantly, you don't have to light yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, especially when that someone else is already getting their warmth from another source entirely. The person who betrayed you may have convinced you that you're being unreasonable, that you're overreacting, that you're throwing away something good over a mistake. But systematic deception isn't a mistake. It's a choice that gets made over and over again, day after day, lie after lie. You deserve someone who chooses you consistently, not someone who chooses you only when it's convenient. You deserve transparency, not carefully crafted stories designed to keep you from asking the right questions. You deserve a partner who builds a life with you, not someone who builds a life around you while secretly building a different life behind your back. The road forward isn't easy, but it's honest. And after living in a world of lies for so long, honesty feels like the most radical act of self-care you can commit to. Even when it hurts, even when it's lonely, even when it means starting over from scratch. Because starting over from scratch is still better than building on a foundation of lies that was never solid to begin with. Trust yourself, walk away, move forward. You'll be okay. I promise you that much.